Coming next on C-SPAN, coverage of a discussion titled Strategies for the Left. The event was sponsored this past Thursday by The Nation magazine and the University of Michigan Law School. It's part of a series of lectures conducted by the law school's chapter of the National Lawyers Guild. The organization invited Alexander Cockburn to deliver remarks. He is a columnist for The Nation. We take you now to the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor.
Good evening. I'd like to welcome you all to the law school and to the National Lawyers Guild Strategies for the Left speaker series. This is the second speech of the series. Our first speaker was Arthur Kanoy, progressive constitutional lawyer and now professor at Rutgers University. Our goal in this series was to bring together a variety of diverse perspectives on new strategies for the left ways of bringing the left out of the marginal, unfortunately, fringes of our political strata. And to that end, we've brought Alexander Cockburn tonight to speak. And I'd now like to introduce my friend Peter Siskin from The Nation, who has facilitated this speech from the New York end, and who will introduce Mr. Cockburn. Thank you.
Good evening. I just want to welcome you all also. I'm from The Nation magazine. For those of you who don't know, just the basic information, it's a weekly magazine of politics and culture that Alexander Cockburn writes for regularly. And there are free issues in the back if you want to take one and browse. And because I heard that Jerry Brown's 1-800 number went over well, we have a 1-800 number for subscription information, which I was requested to give you all, which is 1-800-333-8536, which you can call for information. But after that sort of shameless plug, we can get on with it. And Alexander Cockburn, we're glad to have him. He's been a regular contributor to The Nation since 1984. His columns appear every other week in The Nation, and it seems more times than not, when his column, Beat the Devil, isn't running, we usually have a long exchange of letters debating one point or another of his. He, until recently, was a regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal for 10 years, and he's syndicated another column called Ashes and Diamonds in various alternative media. His two most recent books are Corruptions of Empire, which is a collection of his columns from the early and mid 80s, I suppose, and most recently with Susanna Hecht, a book called Fate of the Forest. And from that, I think we'll bring on Alex and Alexander Cockburn.
Well, you just heard fuel for the Jerry Brown campaign. You know, by the single act of giving out that 800 number, he could deduct the trip. That's what Jerry Brown was on about. Well, here we are to talk about the perspectives of strategies for the left in the wake of an event which occurs every 4 years, which makes one think that no strategy for the left is ever possible, which is the New York primary campaign, won by Governor Clinton. I see that when asked what mattered to them most, the supporters of Governor Clinton, when they got to honesty, 4% of them said that's what mattered. 96% of the people voting for Governor Clinton thought honesty wasn't an issue, which if you support Governor Clinton, it isn't an issue. You might as well be realistic about it. So here we are now contemplating the Clinton-Bush race. a real battle of pygmies in my view, but and a very depressing perspective, since in most important matters, I think they're virtually indistinguishable. And so, with this lamentable situation where the best that can be offered after 12 years of Reagan-Bush is the governor of a right-to-work state who's about to proceed to urge the execution of another black person, this time innocent probably, as a way of ingratiating himself with what's called the center, we should see what the situation is for the left and what we can look forward to. Usually when people talk about the strategies for the left, they start by depressing everybody a lot. I've always noticed that left people are very good at depressing themselves and each other when they look at the world. My dad, who told me years ago when he was in New York in the 30s, that he used to see a Communist Party organizer haranguing the masses. And the organizer would say, "Comrades, as we stand here today, millions of our brothers and sisters are being horribly tortured in the dungeons and cells of the British Raj in India. Millions more are groaning under the lash of tyranny and oppression in Latin America. Join the Communist Party." And people kind of back off a bit. We have, item A on the agenda is exactly the fact that we are now in the 12th year of a savage offensive by property, by capital, against labor, against the gains that have been won since the Depression. It's an onslaught that in Europe, actually in this week, might be receiving a little bit of a check. Actually, we're talking on the very day of a British election, where at the moment it's unclear what's going to happen, but it could be that a coalition of Liberal and Labour against the Conservatives might come to power. In this country, we've seen a merciless assault on rights of organizing. We've seen an assault on basic social safety nets. We've seen a relentless and often fairly successful attempt to lower the cost of labor. This is, to my view, central to what's been happening since Jimmy Carter made his decisive turn to the right halfway through his term in the late 70s. And since that time, the attack, the right-wing offensive, has continued without remission. And I think if we're to look at strategy and to look at the future at all, we have to see what the terms of why that offensive took place. And of course the reasons, I'm sure you know, which is that by the middle 70s, the system was not producing in the way it had been in the post-war period. The rate of profit was going down. Real wages peaked in the US in 1973. The groundwork for the offensive was laid in the middle 70s, at the time that the ruling orders perceived what they called a crisis of democracy, meaning that things were getting out of control. In fact, there was a possibility of a democratic offensive in the wake of Watergate, in the wake of the Vietnam War. And from the mid-70s on, the counterattack began in earnest. Many of the instruments in that attack were developed by neoliberals in democratic think tanks. as well as by neoconservatives in conservative think tanks. There was a bipartisan offensive. An offensive on regulation, an offensive on basic social safety nets, an offensive on social spending, an offensive on the priorities of the previous period. And really, when you look at some of the most damaging, you'll find that they actually came out of liberal think tanks, neoliberal think tanks. Simultaneous to that, you had, I think, a very important area. You had a fairly serious purging of an already extremely conservative media. I'm talking, of course, of the corporate media. With the promulgation of the illusion that in the 60s, the press, the mainstream press, the corporate press, had somehow been seditious. As anyone old enough to remember, or curious enough to go back and look at the files, the press was extraordinarily compliant through the Vietnam War, which is the one that's always cited. The first editorial in the United States attacking the Vietnam War was in the Boston Globe, I think in 1967. Right the way across the board, you had this attack. Simultaneous to that, you had a very fierce attack internationally, where the strategies of development, which the developed countries were advocating for the poor countries, the less developed countries, the third world, were all abandoned and thrown over the side. If you go back and look, you'll find, and look in the library, you can look up a book by Walt Rostow, an advisor to Kennedy and then to Johnson, called Stages of Economic Development, an Anti-Communist Manifesto, published in 1960. And in that book, Rostow said that if countries, developed poor countries, followed a non-communist, that was the item 1 on the agenda, a non-communist agenda, went through various stages, they would, in the fullness of time, end up as prosperous, emergent capitalist countries. If you go and look now, when you're not reading things about the failure of communism, many of which critiques are, of course, perfectly accurate, and study what's happened to the third world, you'll find a map of disaster of an almost unparalleled degree. In the last 10 to 15 years, per capita income, living standards, the proportion of per capita income in poor countries as rated against the core capitalist countries has plunged by as much as 50, 60, 70%. You're looking at a rollback in much of the third world, a rollback in standards, which takes many of them back to before the Second World War. You have now, obviously, the indices of this are emerging more and more conspicuously, with outbreaks of diseases that hadn't been seen, such as the cholera epidemics, systematic and permanent malnutrition, and, of course, staggering debt, with a net outflow of capital from the poor countries to the rich countries. And in many ways, I think if one's going to think about somewhere like Iraq today, I see Iraq really now as a paradigm of what the first world or the advanced world has done to the third world in a fairly dramatic way. Because what's going on now in Iraq is a forcing of the country back into underdevelopment. You can be fiercely critical of Saddam Hussein, and I certainly have been and would be and am. But what Iraq had evolved was, by the standards of the area, a system of social maintenance which was not bad in such areas as health. What the present embargo is doing is systematically forcing Iraq back into a much more primitive and inequitable stage, where, of course, the people most systematically penalized are the poor, the extremely poor, and the people who are doing okay are the better off and the rich. So what you see in Iraq is a symbol of what's happening throughout much of the third world. And of course, reflecting that, though not really to the same, generally to the same levels of social desperation, you have the onslaught at home, where ideologically the strategists of present social and economic arrangements have abandoned any principles of generalized equity throughout the society, and basically seen poorer people, the lower sectors of the economy, as essentially expendable. It's clear that this situation, the situation of accelerating social stratification, accelerating differentials in income quintiles, accelerating onslaught on organized labor, is not going to subside. There isn't an economic, if you examine what the economic strategies, for example, being advanced this year, there is no one advocating an economic strategy that will reverse this situation. In other words, the onslaught is going to continue. It's not necessarily so that it should continue. And it's interesting, if you look at Europe and the strategies in Europe, you can see that another approach has been advanced, particularly by the Commissioner of the Common Market, Jacques Delors, the French Catholic socialist, which still advances some form of a social equity contract and a high wage strategy as core to a decent economic program. That is not the case here. And actually, it's fairly instructive to examine the economic programs of the candidates who've been going around. Maybe you have. But if you look at what the crises that are confronting the American economy are now, crises of, let's say, conversion from military spending. The US economy has basically been sustained by military spending since about 1938, when the second phase of the New Deal really had ceased to deliver, and the economy was bailed out by the preparations for the Second World War. After the war was over, there were many fears that the United States would relapse once again into depression. If you go back and read the literature of the time in 1945, 1946. By 1947-48, the strategy had been very clearly and explicitly laid out. The thing that would sustain the American economy would be military spending as an underpinning for the economy. And of course, that strategy was ratified by the Korean War. And really, it's continued until the last year or two. And it's gradually dawning on people, including people on the left, that talk about economic conversion may be easy, but you can talk about a peace bonus, but you still have to deal with the fact that, let's say, United Technologies in Connecticut lays off 17,000 people. Or in California, about 1 million aerospace jobs have been lost. What do you do with those people? You can talk about infrastructural repair. That's a lot of interstate highways being repaired. a lot of building contractors getting happy, is it really going to do much to the economy? No candidate, no one in the field, apart from, in a somewhat vague rhetorical way, Jerry Brown on occasion, has advanced any idea of substance to deal with this situation and this crisis. And one of the things that has been most clearly displayed in this year, I think, is a shortage of ideas pervading certainly the right, certainly the mainstream neoliberals, represented more or less by the great governor of Arkansas, and even, I think, throughout much of what we could call the left. And I think if one's going to talk about strategy, one has to note positive things which people often ignore, but then be fairly critical, I think, of a central lack of larger ideas. I mean, it's obvious from the point of view of strategy that one of the first strategies for the left is to defend the defenseless. Really, to try and hold the line on renewed and continuous assault on poor people, on basic rights. There's no mystery there. These are holding actions. Beyond that, people often deplore left failures by saying, you know, the left throughout the country is hard to detect. That we've lived for so long in a conservative environment that the left has virtually disappeared. I think that's an illusion, partly fostered by the corporate press. Of course, if you just turn on your television set and look at McNeil Lehrer, or for that matter, listen to All Things Considered, you receive a parched and shriveled view of what's actually happening in the society. There's no question about that. That across the country, in town after town, in community after community, progressive fights, some of them successful, are going on. There's no question about that. There's no question that there are enormous reservoirs of social activism, once again, virtually ignored by the mainstream. And they're not hard to see where they're occurring. They're occurring in organized labor, in the midst of the attack of capital and of business, such as with the Caterpillar workers, for example. They're occurring in plant after plant across the country, but they're also occurring in areas such as the environment. If you want to hearten yourself, you want to listen to a few extremely right-wing people going on about the power of the environmental movement. You can get very encouraged in about 5 minutes. As they list off the hundreds of thousands of dollars raised, the hundreds of thousands of environmental activists. And after a bit of listening to someone like Representative Dannemeyer of Orange County, California, you'll begin to think you're running the country. You aren't, of course, but... But at that level, there is an enormous organized presence. And the other new social movements have also produced movements of power and far greater potential political power, such as has been recently demonstrated, I think, in Chicago with the defeat of Dixon in that Democratic primary. There are, I think, one of the central areas where the left can see fertile and important grounds for organization in local ways is precisely in a coalition of environmentalism and labor. Not the environmentalism of, let's say, the Sierra Club, but environmentalism where it really involves poor people. And that's, of course, the environmentalism that addresses toxics, addresses living conditions in urban communities. There's an organization in Los Angeles called LA Watchdog, which has organized itself around the issue of air. If you cut open a kid who's been killed in the streets of East LA and look at their lungs, they've got the lungs of, let's say, a 50-year-old person in terms of the amount of toxics and poisons that that kid has been ingesting. That organization has based itself in poor communities, has recruited people on these issues of everyday life, and has had a major effect on regulation of environmental regulation in Los Angeles. For example, there's a thing called the Air Quality Management District in Los Angeles that rules on very, very important things like toxic emissions and the like, on auto use, to try and discourage people driving into downtown LA. They put up the parking rates. This, of course, penalizes poor people. Well, LA Watchdog forced the AQMD to recognize that issues of gender, race, and class, they formally recognized it, had to be considered when they were rulemaking. This is a use of environmental issues in a way that obviously has enormous political potential. And it starts with activism actually within a neighborhood, a district, then a city, and it also obviously involves addressing matters of labor as well as just purely community. I think if you look at areas like that, you can find many examples of successful activism. Where I think the left has had greater failures is in articulating a larger, coherent social vision. In a sense, the left, I think, has ceased to think big enough. And I think there's an interesting illustration recently in the campaign of Jerry Brown in the reaction to his flat tax idea. Jerry Brown came up with a flat tax plan, and the immediate reaction of most people on the, well, ranging across the liberal to left spectrum was, this is a terrible idea, it's regressive, and by implication, the present system is progressive. And people were immediately in the position of defending the present system of tax levying in this country. The best, I thought, single analysis of the actual tax system in this country was Leona Helmsley, the woman in New York who faces jail for tax evasion. She said only the little people pay taxes. A fairly crisp analysis of what goes on. But speaking as someone who expressed conditional support for a flat tax plan with various additions to it, I was startled to hear many of my friends, many people I know, savagely denouncing it, and being then put in this position of saying the present system is the better way to go. Although it's clear that the present system has done nothing to redistribute, nothing to alter basic inequalities in this society for the last 50 years. Now, what should maybe of an interesting left reaction have been? To have said, okay, let's look at the plan. What does it do? Is it regressive? And if it's regressive, is the basic principle interesting to simplify it? And if it's an interesting principle, how can we render that principle into something that isn't regressive? And then you might say, well, we could, for example, have a simple tax, knock out a lot of the deductions, and have a wealth tax. No one knows really who the rich people are in the society. You know a lot of them, but they've never, if you had a wealth tax on, let's say, incomes of over 100,000 or net assets of whatever, you have a fairly clear map of who owns what. You could have a basic guaranteed social wage. You could introduce concepts which would actually reverse the present trend and not merely defend an increasingly ramshackle system. What happened was that Brown came under savage assault by the Citizens for Tax Justice, which is a liberal lobbying organization, who was attacked by everybody, who basically invented a plan he never produced. And nobody said, well, an important thing about Brown's plan is that you shift the attention from the tax plan, from the tax raising, managing the economy through various systems of deductions, tax exemptions, the present system, and you just say, well, simplify the way we collect the money and we'll turn our attention to the way we spend it, which is the other shoe dropping. Because when you turn attention, you say, we're going to try and cleanse that system and look at how we spend it, then you are really starting a major debate. You're saying, we've collected all this money, now what are we going to do with it? Are we going to have national planning? What kind of national planning are we going to have? And then you're into a coherent discussion of what an economic strategy should be. Because unless the left really comes up with a coherent strategy, it is left with a number of defensive fights which are essential, but never a forward vision of what economic reality in the year 2010, equitable economic reality, might be. And that is the great lack. So, for example, if a kind of Brown proposal for simplifying the tax code is first of all linked, as he did it, I have to say, with national health insurance, you've got the beginnings of a social idea. And if you then link that with saying, well, what is our basic approach to conversion? What will be the central motor of the economy? This isn't just saying we're going to stop having a defense contractor make guns and they're going to build aluminum canoes like Grumman. You'd have to build an awful lot of aluminum canoes to crank up the same income. What's it going to be? And there you have an area of, let's say, the environment, where you have a major environmental strategy, let's say of high-tech, clean energy requirements, and the rest of it. And you can see the basis of an economic plan emerging. What the left has really failed to come up with is a sense of scale in the economy. And so therefore, I think it's been forced time and time again to cede ground to the right. And these days, if you find yourself talking and arguing about what the socialist vision might be, you'll very often find people tacitly conceding that they've lost the economic argument and they're not quite sure how to recover it. And in that situation, the neoliberals occupy the vacuum. And this argument is lost not only domestically, but it's lost internationally. Because what do we see now when you look across the world? You see neoliberalism as the ruling philosophy of the day. Relentless privatization. The greatest looting of public assets, probably in the history of the world, is now going on. As country after country sells its telephone companies, sells its steel companies, sells its various state assets, sells them to foreign investors and local entrepreneurs who immediately disperse the assets, loot the assets, and move on. This is called neoliberal freeing up of the economy. And it moves hand in hand with looting of resources. After all, what does the freeing up of world trade mean? It means that suddenly a subsistence farmer in, let's say, Nigeria faces import of cheap grain from Europe, cheap crops from Europe or the United States. What happens? The subsistence farmer is undercut, is forced off the land, goes to Lagos, adds to the urban crisis in Lagos, and Nigerian agriculture goes to pieces. This is a story that can be told time and time and time again. How can a counterattack take place? Obviously by people recovering some sense of overall social vision. We see it again. We're about to have the UN Conference on the Environment in Rio. George Bush has said, magnificent social statement of reforming zeal. He will go only if it's good for America. One of the most sort of stupid, relentlessly stupid statements in recent political memory. What is only if it's good for America? If America could sell 1 million refrigerators to China, it might be good for America. And then those millions of refrigerators in China will destroy the environment. What's good for America? It's almost paralyzing to contemplate someone who thinks that that is an articulate statement and assumes that the audience is so stupid as to believe it. But, once again, you can only argue about the environment in a coherent way, argue about, let's say, development in Brazil, development in the third world, if you have some sense of confidence in ideas of national planning, in ideas of a reasoned argument against untrammeled free enterprise. Now, the argument against untrammeled free enterprise is being made with some clarity in Eastern Europe, where you'll recall in the wake of the collapse of the old communist regimes, the newspapers were full day after day, month after month, year after year with bouncy stories about the bursting vim and vigor of these countries now shaking themselves free of the yoke of communist torpor. Always stories about happy young entrepreneurs, Leszek, the hamburger entrepreneur, pictures of bustling marketeers throwing aside the chain. Meanwhile, the actual indices of what's happened are surfacing, if anyone has the curiosity to look. You have the Polish economy in ruins, staggering levels of unemployed people. If you talk to anyone who's gone back to Poland, seen what's going on, soaring levels of crime, a minute layer of successful entrepreneurs, many of them criminal, all of them devoted to looting and selling off their resources. I recently saw somewhere that a lot of antique dealers in Europe are going to Poland and looting the churches because the Poles can no longer afford the guards. And the Polish answer was, this is very lamentable, we should have a properly regulated market in selling off these portions of our national heritage. And probably there is something truly tragic and pathetic in many of the people who believe that a capitalist society can be conjured from the inert clay, like that, kaboom, a free market, let it be. And everyone stands around waiting for a vibrant entrepreneurial middle class to emerge without any capital. You can't do it. So what will happen and what is happening in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union is clearly, for many, many people, for I would say the bulk of the people, a drastic collapse, long-term collapse of living standards. The unlikelihood of any cohesive, progressive political economy emerging for a very long time. And what do we see in this country, in the present stage, I think is somewhat the same. And I think the great challenge is for people on the left primarily to start thinking big again. Because that, I think, is the energy that is wanting very often. Because the partial fights, the local fights, the efforts at solidarity, at defending the defenseless, is in a way so all-consuming. And the sense, I think, for many people of adverse secular conditions that we were born or we were now existing in a rather dismal stage in the century, the people lack that larger ambition. Does this translate into immediate political action? I think what it calls for immediately is a larger sense of that political ambition. After all, we live in a year, this year, which makes 1988 look rather triumphalist. After all, in 1988, Jesse Jackson had stitched together a fairly large, broad political coalition. Jackson was producing fairly carefully thought out ideas on a whole number of social fronts in terms of policy. Many disparate groups had been brought together. Of course, the campaign, the Jackson campaign, incurred, naturally enough, the full savagery of the establishment. In exactly the same rituals of subjugation that you've just seen happening in New York. It happened in New York in 1988. Jackson got as far as Atlanta, made his peace with the party regulars, Dukakis. He got a speech. Dukakis, the day after the convention, went down to Neshoba in the south and basically spoke to a Ku Klux Klan rally. Jackson, and I was there, Jackson addressed the activists who'd gone to Atlanta the day after the convention was over. And he said, we're in this for the long haul. This is a movement. We'll be fighting in the next years. We'll be fighting in state capitals. We'll be fighting wars, battles to defend the defenseless, to advance our cause. And that was the end of it. That was the end of it. Within a month or two, it was clear that there was going to be no continuity in any real sense of the word. The Rainbow Coalition was turned by Jackson himself into a top-down organization. Local initiatives were actively discouraged. And within the year, the whole thing was over. Absolutely no continuity. You'd think that 4 years later, some advance might have been made. This time the standard is carried by Brown, with a more attenuated organization. I mean, people who talk about the Brown organization, well, some of you here may have been involved. The word organization is a fairly large word to describe. I met a kid in New York when I was interviewing Governor Brown. He said, I'm in charge of 13 states. None of which he'd barely had time to visit or even telephone. There wasn't a campaign, essentially. There was the achievement of showing that you could run a campaign with an 800 number. And again, Brown, with a far more shriveled organization and a far more, in some ways, equivalent postures. I mean, I've defended the flat tax, but the flat tax can also be portrayed accurately, if it goes the other way, as a very regressive effort. And he lost heart in even trying to defend it. I did a better defense of it than he did. How much continuity will be there? I mean, he is still in the field. He'll be in the field certainly until Pennsylvania. Will any real resistance be mounted up to the Democratic Convention or after it? It seems very unlikely at this stage. In other words, across two major election campaigns, very little in the way of a larger presence beyond existing movements, existing coalitions, has developed. Can we look forward to another cycle of the same again? With this time, perhaps, a neoliberal in the White House, very much of the Carter strain, a president, if he becomes president, totally congenial to business, with absolutely no history of commitment to even to traditional liberal ideas. What will be the development and tenor of the left then. And of course, this against a situation where the relentless assaults, many of you are lawyers. I mean, none of you need to be told what's happening in the federal system. I gather the ACLU is now immensely hesitant even to bring cases in the federal system. It's looking more and more to state courts. There is no remit at that level. How much energy is there to build and develop a serious left-wing movement? There are, of course, as there often have been in the past, efforts to develop a party of labor, whether it's Tony Mazzocchi of the OCAW or other initiatives of the same sort, to which one would wish every encouragement. I don't think one can never build a party out of a letterhead and say, let it be. Now we have a party. That's been tried many times in the past and has never had any real staying power. Obviously, such a larger presence has to come out of hard coalition work. It has to come out of a commitment by organizers across the country to try and see what the outlines, the silhouettes of this larger movement will be, and not rely or not be forced into the position, which has now happened twice, of having just one standard bearer. Although I wouldn't wish prematurely to wish the Brown campaign into oblivion, and I hope some national presence is maintained and resistance in New York at the convention. But I think unless the left can recover this larger sense of social strategy, this larger sense of what the political economy of a juster country might be, a larger picture of what a juster world economy might be, then we're in for a dismal time. Because when you look at the situation, we are now essentially moving towards a single world economy. Time and again, I don't need to say this particularly loudly in Michigan. Time and again, when you look at a local issue, you're looking at the world economy. I'll give you an example. I lived for a long time until recently in Watsonville, California, which is a farm town, which had an important position in the frozen vegetable industry. In fact, for 6 months of the year, it provided 80% of the frozen vegetables in the United States. The crops were cut by Mexican workers, mostly from Michoacan, at about $6 to $8 an hour. The locally owned processing houses were taken over by larger processing houses. They were taken over by Pillsbury. Green Giant was taken over by Pillsbury. Pillsbury was taken over by Grand Metropolitan Hotels based in London. What happened then? Grand Metropolitan Hotels decided that the cost of production were rather better in Mexico. And so they started growing their crops, buying their crops from Irapuato in Mexico, which used to be a self-sustaining area. Irapuato, Mexico then became export agriculturally based, which means that the basic subsistence costs for people there went up. The crops got cut by the same workers, or relatives of the same workers very often, not earning $6 an hour, but earning $6 a day. The crops were then packed up, shipped across the border, sent up to a non-union packing house in Ohio, and distributed. Watsonville itself, from being a farm town, will become probably a bedroom suburb of San Jose and the computer industry. Because at a certain point, the price of farmland is unfavorable relative to the price of real estate land. You'll have a disintegrated community, impoverished workers, exploited workers in Mexico, and some satisfied shareholders in London. You all know this story. It happens in every town, or most towns, and you can see it from the other end. I grew up in Ireland, where when I was growing up, there would be signs on the local factories if they were foreign-owned, British go home, or expressions of national economic confidence. From being a fully employed town, my hometown in Youghal, Southern Ireland, population about 6,000, now rests entirely on 4 small high-tech companies, employing women between the ages of about 17 and 25, non-union. And no one's writing "go home" on the walls, although all the decisions affecting that town are taken in American cities. This is a central reality for any movement here. How can you talk about economic recovery? How can you talk about economic justice unless you're also talking about the workers who are doing the cheaper jobs, the workers who are working for a few cents an hour in China? Capital has internationalized itself effortlessly. From the capital point of view, from business's point of view, there is a world government now. You have a United Nations Security Council run by the United States largely, and you have a world economy largely run by the G7 countries, and ultimately a few bankers. This is the great disproportion. Labor is still at an extraordinarily primitive stage of international organization, even though efforts have been made. For example, the Teamsters in Watsonville did form common cause with organizations representing the Mexican workers down in Irapuato and sent them help. There are other examples where people are increasingly realize if you're going to have any effect, you can't just organize here, you have to organize in the countries to which these companies have fled. You have to establish those international ties. Otherwise, capital, business, will always have the whip hand. It'll always be able to whipsaw between the various labor markets. I don't think the situation from that point of view is nearly as dismal as people might think, as capital isn't infinitely fugitive. It has to have fixed places. It can be attacked in these various locales. People are more inclined to think internationally. But unless people have these larger perspectives in which to set the smaller fights, if you're only left with the smaller fights and not the larger vision, then I don't think any consistent drive, any consistent counterattack will ever come to real fruition. Thank you. Well, so some questions. Anyone feels like asking any questions? I'll repeat the questions. No questions. What were the strengths and weaknesses of the movement against the Persian Gulf War, and what are the lessons that can be learned from that experience? Thank you, Karima. Karima used to work, a colleague at The Nation magazine, and very active, I think, throughout some of the war. I think, from my point of view, I think, and people may feel strongly otherwise, that initially people weren't clear about the illegality and folly of some people against the war, against the prospect of war, weren't clear enough about Saddam Hussein and the folly and illegality of his act, and indeed the nature of his regime. And I say this having also said that Iraqi social arrangements were in many ways a model in many social programs in terms of treatment of women, in terms of, as I said, of health and so forth, were a model in comparison with many other countries in the Middle East. Point one. Point two, I think, and I would include myself in such a criticism, I think that the rapidity of the conversion of the UN Security Council into an extension of the White House was far, far faster and far more total than might have been imagined, and clearly went hand in hand with the collapse of the Soviet Union as any kind of serious force in world politics. We're sitting here today, and clearly the former Soviet Union is no force at all, except as rattling an occasional begging bowl. But even as recently as the war, there was some, if you recall, let's say Gorbachev's effort at the last minute to try and arrive at a settlement, people were still taking it fairly seriously. I think now I think people paid excessive attention and I think exaggerated the immediate military effects of the war. I'm not one of those people who believe that hundreds of thousands of people were killed in the war. I think the casualties then were low. I am one of those people who think that the casualties and future casualties from the embargo are enormous. And it's the attack on Iraqi society now, particularly on the poor. These are the people who are suffering every single day. Children are dying because of this embargo. And I think that's a thing that's happened in the past. It's harder to muster opposition to an embargo than it is to, let's say, immediate military invasion or attack. But this was clear in the case of Nicaragua. The very, very large movement of solidarity with the Sandinistas in this country was in many ways successful in intimidating the Reaganites. I would say this is true. Successful in preventing outright military invasion. But what happened, of course, was a total lack of success in combating the embargo, which was devastating to Nicaragua and to the Sandinistas. The embargo was extremely successful, but it's slow, it's relentless, but it's somehow less high profile than if 15 F-111s are bombing something. But in the long term, probably more successful. And I think now, I think abroad in the country, there's a large measure of disillusion about the war. A measure of dissatisfaction. People aren't dumb. They can see that Saddam Hussein's still sitting there. They can see that the Kurds are in a dreadful state and were betrayed by Bush, who urged them to rise and then sat back while they were attacked. The Shia in the south similarly. They can see these things going on. They can feel now that many of the claims of the war have been exposed as baseless, including the performance even of the famous Patriot missiles. No single proof of any scud being done by a Patriot, by the way, as established by Conyers' subcommittee. I think people are discontented with that and suspicious of Bush and alert. I think many people are alert and cynical to the likelihood of an attempt to have another adventure. Libya, Cuba, North Korea. I think people are alert to that. This is not to say that in a kind of electronic Nuremberg rally they won't be swept off their feet again, or enough people. Because the regime, one thing the Bush-Reagan people have learned, it's how to mount these saturation propaganda offensives. But I think what there hasn't been, and it's very hard to organize, is enough resistance and enough calls to end the embargo. I think that's the great present failure at the present time.
Do you think there's actually a difference between Bush and Clinton or whoever would be the Democratic nominee, and that's why nothing has been said clearly in Maine when Connie Privet, the ambassador, was appointed by Bush to go to Venezuela? Why is it there's supposed to be 35 people in the basement of the White House or somewhere searching up all the dirt on any prospective Democratic candidate. They say it doesn't matter if the Republican or Democrat wins, and that's why we have been fishing the dirt on Bush.
Does it matter whether Bush or Clinton win? Many people will argue that it does matter. And you can argue, to me there's not much evidence of a progressive Clinton, but you can still argue, and maybe many people here want, it's certainly not unprovable, that he's, for example, in judicial appointments, he would be better. He couldn't be worse. And you could say, by that single token, it's better to vote for Clinton, if assuming Clinton is the nominee. And that's a respectable argument. I'm not saying it's a wrong argument. I'm saying the pressure, by the way, was on we're what, 2 or 3 days away from the New York primary. People were saying to me and to other people, other people have been saying for the last month, rally around the nominee, to which one said, it's not over yet. This was being said a month ago. And I did object to that, to say that, you are, because a long-term strategy by the Democratic establishment to produce a candidate which in many ways is indistinguishable from George Bush in my view. When it comes to labor, terrible. Environment, a nightmare. Death penalty, throw that switch, man. And Mexico free trade. Look at you, you know the tune, you know the words. Yes, he would be in favor of, a measure of force against Saddam Hussein, wouldn't discount intervention. You watch. As the months go by, it'll get harder and harder to say. So eventually you're in the Tony Lewis position, as I always think of it. He said, whenever I think about presidential politics, all I think about is nominations to the bench and to the Supreme Court. Well, maybe in the final agonized moment in the polling booth in next November, you can think, well, Clinton would appoint someone great. And maybe that'll be that spasm which will make you throw the switch. Not his switch, your switch, But my point being, to continue with your question, does that mean then easing up on, don't hear about Bush? Well, one thing is we've been in the Democratic campaign, so that's been where the journalistic effort is at. Bush, there was not much of a moment when we thought Pat Buchanan was going to be the nominee. It's going to be George Bush. What's been happening for the last few months is the story has been the struggle, the politics around the nomination battle. Speaking as someone who writes about these things, that's where my energy has been expended. But so far as George Bush is concerned, is it propitious to attack him? Of course it is. I was thinking only today, actually, one of the great failures, the many innumerable failures of journalism, mainstream corporate journalism in the last few years, has been they've forgotten how to describe ordinary life in Washington, the pig-out. The sense of, there's been a lot about the House scandals, of course, and check bouncing. Vast tracts of Washington are no longer covered. Department after department, it's like explorers lost in some country in the 19th century. They never see any journalists come by. It's unknown terrain. Where looting has continued uninterruptedly now for 12 years. People are waddling down the main avenues of Washington with so much stolen money in their pockets they can barely stand up. We're not talking checks here. We're talking really large sums of money. The pig out has been continuing without remit. And you're absolutely right. George Bush, well, the personal life is one thing. But the larger questions, which remain totally unanswered politically about the Reagan-Bush years, Bush's participation in illegal activities in shipping arms to the Contras, just to name but one. And I think, of course, it's absolutely necessary, even if you do think there's no difference between the two, and you don't even think that Clinton would appoint some marvelous person to the bench, it still behooves you to attack, vigorously the Republicans. You're absolutely right. I think maybe there's a perspective thing here because we've been in this primary season. Oh, you mean the line about him having... Yeah, there was a tease. Well, I have a healthy respect for the libel laws, you know. I said that maybe Bush wouldn't attack Clinton so much for his amorous activities because supposedly Bush had made one of his mistresses an ambassador. Well, I knew who the ambassador was. I'm not going to tell you who it was because of my healthy respect for the libel laws, but my distaste for that kind of thing. But it seemed sort of appropriate to put it down at that point because I think there will be a trade-off, actually. And, you know, there's many scandals connected with Clinton and the airport at Mena in western Arkansas in the Contra War, which I've been writing about a lot in The Nation with my associates. But again, that's not going to be something George Bush is going to bring up, assuming, for very, very obvious reasons. Clinton's been lousy on the environment. I don't think we're going to have George Bush bringing that one up. What I have to say is that if you look at the Clinton, assuming you just took everything out and looked at Clinton's economic program, it's terrible. Well, that's a cruel blow. That's a cruel blow. Wait a few months. What? Not really. There's only so many things you can do in a day. I mean, you know, you get into a thing. You think about Clinton all the time. You hate Clinton. You get up in the morning and you're powered by your loathing of Clinton. At least I am. That's the way I am, but you know, there are certain primal instincts. Then I got sort of excited about Jerry Brown. I probably went overboard for Jerry Brown in a way I shouldn't have done, but he seemed to me a creative character. People kept saying he's an opportunist. So what? You know, all politicians take advantage of opportunity. Is there a consistent thread in Brown's career? I think there is. I think he was a good governor of California, certainly for his first term. He was excellent on things like toxics. He was pretty good on labor. Okay, I think maybe we should go a bit towards the back of the room. I can't see you against the lights. Is there someone up there?
What about Clinton cocaine? Do you think anybody's going to pick up your tip to use cocaine?
All I did was say, which is true, that people on his security staff have called him the snowman. He breathed, but he forgot, he didn't sniff.
Speaking of strategies for the left, what do you see sort of internationally and internationally with the demise of the Soviet Union as space, newer strategies, the demise of the Soviet
Oh, you mean...
strategies for the left here internationally?
Did people hear the question? Did the demise of the Soviet Union produce opportunity for the left? You mean that the old Cold War rationales disappeared, that kind of thing?
What does that do for the future? I know in the Eastern article was sort of lamenting the loss of that.
You mean the loss of the Soviet Union? Yeah, well, look, I mean, my view was that the Soviet Union, and, you know, taking into account all the inequities and, you know, disasters of that economic system, but also recognizing that a lot of people had protections and standards that they're rapidly losing in the present alternative. But the point I was always making there is it did act as a check on the United States in the Third World. There was a certain check there. I mean, that vote in the Security Council had times when it was important. The Vietnamese would have been pulverized completely. There's another place an embargo is continuing with remarkable little fuss. Remarkable little fuss. The long-term vendetta against Vietnam continues absolutely with not too many voices on the left being raised about it, by the way. But it did act as a check. And many people said, and I didn't really agree with them, and I've disputed with them, you know, now that it's collapsed, the Soviet Union, now a left not compromised by Stalinism, not compromised by association with totalitarian communism, can flourish. Well, the question is, where is it flourishing? How is it flourishing? I don't think that those hopes have yet been ratified. Now, is it true that maybe here at last people can go and talk about constructive uses of public money as a substitute for the Cold War military system of production and support? Actually, I think on that level, the debate is only really just beginning. And that's why I say the thought that has to go into producing the alternative vision hasn't yet really been fleshed out. And I think that's one of the great disappointments so far, that people haven't, to go back to what I was saying, thought big enough really about what the objectives are. But obviously, if someone's not going to turn and say, you're selling out the West to the jackboot of Stalin, if you suggest anything, it's good that that's disappeared. Oh, actually, I did it back. Let's go to the front again. Let's see.
I'm afraid it sounds like a depressing leftist.
Well, the question was really about the threat of fascism, in the sense the questioner said anyone living through the mobilization of popular sentiment in the Iraq War, mobilization behind the flag, the yellow ribbons, the thought of fascism must have crossed their minds. And he continued to say that anyone looking at the results in Europe today must fear an emergence of fascism, given the results some results in northern Italy, in Germany in particular. And should the left be mobilizing on a sort of kind of anti-fascist sort of position? Right? I mean, it's clear to go with Europe that sort of right populist nationalism is a major factor and will be a major factor, both in East and Western Europe. I don't think myself of Western Europe that it's a major threat, actually. I would say that rather tentatively. Fascism here, I mean, you can use it in the rhetorical sense. I said an electronic Nuremberg rally. And it is. I mean, there was a moment when you have a tiny measure of diversity in public opinion in the corporate media. Where in the warm-up to the war in Iraq, you could see Ed Said. I mean, for every 10,000 mad generals you had Ed Said, or you had Noam Chomsky. You'd say, hey, one for our side. One. But every week. I went on the Donahue show, and I was amazed, and the audience was very friendly. I was on with Ralph Nader and Richard Barnett. It was a very clear attempt, a show, and most of the people in the show had come to see, I don't know, people who were married to emotionally damaged people having a confrontation or whatever the normal fare was. And it was an anti-war rally. Everyone was in on it. The audience thought it was great. Then, at a point, the guillotine goes down, and that's it. And then you have absolutely wall-to-wall maniacs across the board. I mean, it's amazingly how quickly the media system can crank in. Actually, it began to crank in on old Brown, actually. I was pretty startled. I read a rather comical sentence in the paper today. It said, Clinton, despite the enmity of the New York media, prevailed. I mean, Clinton, endorsed by the New York Times, the New York Post, I think the Daily News, Newsday endorsed Songus. They let Clinton, I mean, every columnist you can think of. Should we be organizing on fascism? I don't think you need to call it fascism at this level of the society. You can just call it, organizing against business as usual, organizing against, I don't know if fascism is the correct term to describe it, frankly.
For example, like they're polling that Perot pick up 20-25%. I mean, there's a very clear political vacuum.
Yeah.
They think that's the potential thing.
Ross Perot, I can't get too worried. Maybe I'm wrong. You can all laugh at me next year. I can't get worried about Perot. Every now and again, people say, Ross Perot, he says it'll take as much money as it takes, his great phrase. Just clean up the mess in Washington and go home. Already, I just was reading the paper on the plane today. They're already cranking up against Perot, pointing out, this feisty man of the people has got by on government subsidy ever since he was a teenager, basically. That he's ripping money out of the taxpayer with a pickaxe every day of the week. You wait. When they really go after Perot, you'll find troubling question raised about Perot's tax exemptions on land deal in Texas. Troubling questions raised about Perot's use of federal funds in computer thing. You wait. When they want to go for someone like that, they'll go for him. It doesn't matter if it's Perot or not. Of course, there is tremendous discontent within the system. And that can take, very baneful forms. I mean, I'm no fan of term limits. I mean, where you have, a generation of neophyte Congress people or state reps go in who haven't the vaguest idea one end of the state house from the other until they're led through it by the nose by the lobbyists. That's not particularly good government. I mean, someone like Dellums, why should someone like Dellums be thrown over the side? Because he's been in the Congress a long time.
I was wondering if you could say something. I heard Chomsky talk a few months back or something, and I didn't hear anything about China. And I was wondering if you could share your thoughts about China in the sense of are they going to have power in the future, influence to add or subtract from this kind of vision of a world government based on economics? And also, if you put any credence into this idea that Clinton was invited last July to the Bilderbergers' giant meeting in Germany or something with Bush and, of course, Brown.
Oh, Bilderberg. Oh, Bilderberg. I remember Bilderberg. People always worry about these Bilderbergs and trilaterals, and there's always organizations where these politicians and bankers get together. It's like the Bohemian Club. And suddenly people say the country is run by the Bohemian Club. I mean, basically, it's a lot of juvenile businessmen running around doing the amateur dramatics. Of course, they sit in the corner and they say, "I'd like to open a factory in Germany. What's the deal with the labor law or something?" And they plot. But if it's not Bilderberg, it's something else. I think it's a mistake to attach too much weight to an institutional name, apart from seeing it as business as usual. China, actually someone told me last night one of the largest sort of pools of capital in the world is the overseas Chinese operating in southern, with factories in southern China with assets of $200 billion. Makes the Medellin cartel look pretty sort of dinky. Well, it's the largest communist country, isn't it? I think the Chinese, contrary to Gorbachev, one of the great historical disasters, in my view, was Michael Gorbachev. Absolute catastrophe. That Russia was led at that moment by a man of his folly and naivety. China did it the other way, and they gave a measure of independence to the rural communes, some of the rural communes. Now you can say, as someone like Bill Hinton did in a monthly review, that you had privatization in China and an immense looting of public resources. Or you can say that actually, at a moment when the Soviets were unable to inaugurate any kind of economic change within the terms of their system, the Chinese did manage it. I mean, I've heard both arguments made. I'm not really clear which is true, actually. On the one hand, I know people in the shoe business who go to southern China, and there are a bunch of teenagers and kids working in factories in conditions which exactly resemble, probably worse than the worst sweatshops of the 19th century in this country or in Europe.
Could they begin a military role in the future? I mean, they need a new enemy or something like that.
Oh, the enemy. Well, yeah, there could be an enemy. I can see. I mean, it's always good to have enemies, and I don't really see them as the enemy, frankly. I mean, not that kind of enemy. You mean justifying military production?
I'm just trying to see if there's a picture that anybody has about whether they're going to join the economic club, or they're going to resist, or they're going to...
I think China's really interesting. I think it's a no, they don't. But it's true, A, that it does remain the world's largest communist country, and you can argue how much it is in name. They have managed an economic transition, which the Soviet Union absolutely failed to do. They obviously are an enormously potent power.
What was your comment or criticism of Gorbachev here a few minutes ago?
Oh, I said that I thought Gorbachev was a historical disaster. I think Gorbachev was long on rhetoric. and very short on substantive achievement. I think he allowed the situation to get out of control in a way he didn't need to have done. I think, for example, in Eastern Europe, he basically ensured the worst possible transition, the worst possible conclusion of regimes such as East Germany. I'm no friend of those regimes, don't get me wrong. But I think it's one thing to basically say, hey, we're getting out, goodbye, which is what he did, which led to massive, immense social dislocation and disaster. If you want to read a good account of what happened in East Germany, actually, Monthly Review had a pretty good article a while back on that. I think, so far as the Soviet Union itself was concerned, he displayed a sort of endless capacity for tactical maneuver and very little substantive strategic sense. And in the end, he ended up being a lapdog internationally. He's now writing columns in the Los Angeles Times hailing the Pope, as a man of immense compassionate social vision. I mean, it's the most disgusting thing you ever saw. And I never liked Gorbachev from day one. And I got a lot of stick for it, but I must say I think my position has won through on that one.
You mentioned term limits a couple moments ago, and I want to sort of go back to that. Brown has put campaign reform, political reform, money reform on the agenda in a way that it hasn't been in a while. But I think we all fear what is going to happen. There are Republicans and other moderate types out there licking their lips, just waiting to co-opt this issue, to toss us a couple of bones like term limits and pay ceilings or whatever, and avoid the fundamental issues of the control of money on politics. Under that scenario, the bad news is that we get the kind of Republican insurrection that the Republicans are licking their lips about, and the good news is, the best possibility is that we retain the sort of completely impotent opposition that we've had during this past 12 years. How do we avoid that? How, when we want to reform the press that informs and the legislature that votes on the reforms that we are talking about, do we form a popular movement that really forces these entities to accept fundamental change rather than slip by with some window dressing?
The question was basically how do we win for a change, right? I don't know how many of you. One answer I think is some of the positions. I don't know how many of you heard Ralph Nader's positions in the early part of the campaign, in which the point that Nader was making basically was when you elect someone president, even if you think they're wonderful, you don't diselect the bankers, you don't diselect the Fortune 500, you don't diselect the Round Table, you don't diselect the Chamber of Commerce. I mean, they're there, they'll always be there. And how do you even up the playing field? And Ralph had a number of suggestions, ranging from, media time, public, recapturing the public airwaves, to all states adopting a referendum and initiative process, to check-offs where people can basically combat utilities and state-owned entities and the like. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. At the present, one of the most radical tools in the hands of a progressive movement, and not all states have it, of course, is the initiative and referendum process. It doesn't mean that you get it like you attack the insurance companies in California, and we haven't noticed a lot of bankrupted insurance executives fleeing for Nevada. They're still there. But, for example, if you can launch with that weapon, you can launch populist campaigns of the left. You can launch them on wealth. You can launch them on reforms of one sort and another. And the only way you can have the legislative or the referendum victory, but then make it meaningful, of course, is to have a continuous movement centered on that issue, which is really hard. And the history very often of these movements is that you get geared up, you have tremendous energy, you win, let's say on insurance, you win, and then the issue fizzles away, the energy diminishes. And I think in many ways, the struggle has to be so multifaceted. The media monopoly is something that's, omnipresent. There are efforts to try and construct networks of, progressive cable networks. People know about deep dish TV, community access. There obviously has to be a systematic assault, continuing assault on, what public broadcasting has become, which is a disgrace most of the time. That has to go hand in hand with, development of these other coalitions that I'm talking about. I don't think there is a magic bromide. You pop in the glass and suddenly you're a super person. Maybe a couple more questions?
Do you think that the large turnout at last weekend's pro-choice march is something that should encourage the left movement as far as broader mobilization is concerned?
Do I think the large turnout at the big demonstration in Washington should encourage? Yes, I think it should, with the thought that, if that tremendous turnout can be converted into long-term concern with issues of class as well, that you turn very often, I think, on the choice movement, issues of class and, the system haven't been evoked enough. That in many ways the concerns of poorer people, of people of color, have been lost very often by the choice movement and ignored the attack on their rights at the expense of just notionally retaining choice, whereas choice has disappeared long ago for many, many people in society. And that's what often depresses me about the choice movement, that they don't seem to reach across the lines. But of course, you get a turnout like that, and it reminds everybody that the resistance to the far-right program on this is absolutely enormous, as people find out, in the polling every now and again. Okay, maybe one more question. I can see a hand at the back.
In order to get sort of social change. But on the other hand, it seems like right now we're seeing a movement of sort of decision-making up from the local and national level to the international level. We're thinking about the global economy before, the issues of international trade and the gas. It seems like more and more decisions are being located at those levels where those sorts of grassroots concerns have a much harder time making an impact. And I was wondering if you could comment on that sort of the globalization of decision-making and how that disenfranchises the grassroots, and comment on that in terms of strategies for the left and what can be done about it.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. It's true that in community after community, the decisions are taken out of the local, whether it's Watsonville, where the decisions were taken in London, whether in the common market it's a decision affecting, let's say, a carrot farmer in County Waterford Island is taken by a commission in Brussels, or whether it's a logger in Humboldt County when the decision is taken in Houston, Texas. Or it's taken ultimately in levels of, whether there's a growth in the economy and increase in demand, decisions taken by a bunch of bankers. And at some levels, it's really hard how do you counter, let's say, to go to Watsonville, a decision taken by Granton Metropolitan Hotels? How do you get at it? How do you strike at the head of the beast? There was an effort to have demonstrations in every community impacted by Grand Metropolitan Hotels, including one outside Grand Metropolitan, but that is obviously a symbolic protest. There were efforts at a boycott. Grand Metropolitan owns Burger King. So in Santa Cruz County, and Monterey County, I think also, there is a continuing effort at a boycott of Burger King. Would this impact, at what point would dent in Burger King sales make Grand Metropolitan think, damn it, we did the wrong thing fleeing to Mexico? It's like writing to the editor. Is there a time at which the editor of the New York Times will say, I'm wrong, socialism is right? There's an inherent propensity of these people not to see the error of their ways. But it has to come. If you have to have the community action at the base, which ultimately becomes the state, ultimately affects the way things are seen in Washington, and simultaneously an assault at higher levels. Now, if you look at the environmental movement, in some ways, was successful the other way around. They did have, let's say, on issues of deforestation, they had input at supranational levels. Let's say in affecting the policy of the World Bank on building dams in the Amazon basin. But they, of course, didn't do it the other way. They didn't also go to communities in the Amazon and say, what do you want? If you go to a bunch of people in the Amazon, they might want a road. The question is then, what kind of road? They might want economic development. They might not want a park with a bunch of tourists from North America or Germany or Japan or wherever it is with a bunch of cameras hanging around their neck, wandering around in their park. They might want any more than a bunch of loggers in Humboldt County want to be living on the dole while, people drive through the woods saying how beautiful they are, which they are. But these are very partial visions. So you have to have the overall vision. Let's say on the environmental front, you have to say, you can talk about global warming, you can talk about ozone depletion, you can talk about CO2 additions to the atmosphere, but you've also got to talk about a bunch of settlers driven off Brazil, driven off the land in southern Brazil by major soybean production, large-scale soybean production, who go to the Amazon, who aren't really responsible. I mean, they're always blamed for the pyromaniac peasant is blamed for deforestation. It's not his fault, largely. And you've got to address that issue, and that's where most of the world environmental movement has utterly failed and shown its tremendous contempt for ordinary people, in my view. And you've got to manage to get these two hooked into each other, which is all very well for me to say, but as it's the end of the evening, I can say it and you can't even challenge me. So.